Ethan Caldwell was a man who had everything: money, fame, and a lifestyle most could only dream of. He had built his fortune through online videos, where he played pranks on people, traveled the world, and showed off his luxurious life. His fans loved him for his boldness, and he loved the attention. But deep down, Ethan didn't respect boundaries. He believed that money could solve any problem, that rules didn't apply to him, and that life was just a game where he always won. One day, Ethan decided to visit London, a city known for its history, grand palaces, and strong traditions. He wasn't interested in learning about its culture, though. To him, it was just another backdrop for his next viral video. He had done wild stunts in Paris, Tokyo, and New York, always pushing limits. Now, he needed something bigger, something that would make people talk. As he walked near Buckingham Palace, something caught his eye. The royal guards. Dressed in their red uniforms and tall black hats, they stood completely still, not reacting to anything around them. Tourists took pictures, trying to make them laugh, but the guards remained motionless, disciplined, and focused. Ethan smirked. This was perfect. He saw an opportunity to create a video unlike any he had done before. He turned to his friends, who were always ready to record whatever crazy stunt he pulled. "Imagine this," he said with excitement. "I throw paint on one of these guys, and they don't even move. It'll be hilarious." His friends hesitated. Even they knew this was different from his usual pranks. "Are you sure about this?" one of them asked. "These guys take their job seriously." Ethan waved off the concern. "Come on, it's just a joke. They won't even react." He pulled out his phone and started a live stream, letting his fans know something big was about to happen. His comments flooded with excitement, with some cheering him on and others warning him not to do it. But Ethan only cared about one thing: views. He walked closer to one of the guards, pretending to admire the palace. The guard stood tall, eyes fixed straight ahead, not acknowledging anyone. Ethan reached into his bag, his heart racing with excitement. The red paint inside the container felt cold in his hands, but all he could think about was the reaction he would get online. People around him sensed something was off. A few onlookers exchanged worried glances, unsure of what he was planning. But Ethan didn't care. He was too caught up in his own game, convinced that whatever happened next would only make him more famous. What he didn't realize was that this single moment, this one careless action, would change his life forever. Ethan stood just a few feet away from the royal guard, gripping the container of red paint tightly. His heart pounded with excitement. His phone was still live streaming, and thousands of people were watching, waiting to see what he would do next. He could already imagine the headlines, the flood of comments, and the millions of views. This was going to be his biggest prank yet. His friends stood nearby, some nervously glancing at the growing crowd. A few tourists had started whispering, sensing that something was about to happen. One elderly couple shook their heads, clearly disapproving of whatever Ethan was planning. But he ignored them. In his mind, this was just another harmless joke. He lifted the container slightly, pretending to adjust his grip. The thick red liquid inside sloshed around. The guard in front of him stood as still as a statue, showing no sign that he even noticed Ethan. The discipline and focus of the royal guards were legendary, and this only fueled Ethan's confidence. He grinned at the camera. "All right, guys, watch this," he whispered, winking at his audience. Then, without hesitation, he swung his arm and tossed the paint. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. The bright red liquid arched through the air, catching the light of the afternoon sun. Gasps filled the air as people realized what was happening. The paint landed on the guard's uniform, splattering across his chest and face. The deep red color spread over the crisp fabric, staining the proud symbol of the royal guard. The crowd went silent. Even Ethan, for the first time in a long time, felt a strange chill run down his spine. He had expected laughter, maybe a few shocked reactions, but instead, The entire atmosphere shifted. A child nearby clutched his mother's hand, eyes wide with confusion. A group of tourists stared in disbelief, unable to process what they had just seen. The royal guard did not move. He stood firm, his posture unbroken, his expression unchanged. The discipline he had trained for, the pride he carried for his duty, would not be shaken by such an act. But something else did happen. From the corner of his eye, Ethan saw movement. A commanding officer, dressed in an official uniform, was approaching fast. His face was stern, his steps quick and full of purpose. Behind him, several security officers were already closing in. Ethan's grin faltered. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. His live stream chat, which had been filled with laughing emojis and cheers just seconds ago, was now changing. Comments flooded in. "What have you done? This isn't funny. You're in serious trouble." His friends took a step back, distancing themselves as if realizing, too late, that this was no harmless prank. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. And then, before he could even think of running, a firm voice called out, "Stay where you are." For the first time in his life, Ethan realized this was not a game. Ethan's heart pounded as he heard the sharp command. The authority in the officer's voice sent a chill down his spine. He turned to see several security officers moving swiftly toward him. The crowd around him had grown, their faces a mix of shock, disbelief, and anger. He had expected laughter, maybe some excitement, but instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of tension. The royal guard, despite being covered in red paint, remained perfectly still. His posture did not break. His expression did not change. It was as if the paint meant nothing to him, as if his duty was far greater than any humiliation. This, more than anything, made Ethan feel uneasy. He had never met someone so unshakable before. "Sir, step away from the guard," one of the officers ordered, his tone firm. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing for a way out. He had always relied on his wealth and fame to escape trouble. Maybe he could apologize, offer money, turn this into another funny moment. He forced a nervous smile and raised his hands. "Hey guys, it's just a joke," he said, trying to sound casual. "No harm done, right?" The officer didn't even blink. "This is not a joke," he replied. "You are under investigation for damaging government property and disorderly conduct." Ethan's stomach twisted. The words sounded heavy, serious. His friends had already backed away, pretending not to be involved. Even his camera crew had stopped filming, realizing this was no longer entertainment. The live stream was still running, but now the comments were brutal. "You went too far. This is disrespectful. You deserve whatever happens next." The officer signaled, and within seconds, Ethan felt a firm grip on his arm. "You need to come with us." Panic set in. Wait. This is all a misunderstanding," he stammered. "I can fix this." But there was no escape. The officers escorted him away, the crowd watching in silence. Some took pictures, others whispered among themselves. He had wanted attention, and now he had it, but not the kind he had imagined. As he was led toward a police vehicle, his mind raced. Would he get a fine? A warning? Surely this wouldn't ruin him. He was too important, too famous for something like this to destroy his life. But deep down, a small, unfamiliar feeling started to creep in. Fear. For the first time, Ethan realized he had no control over what would happen next. Ethan sat in the back of the police vehicle, his hands trembling slightly. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just another prank gone wrong. This wasn't something he could talk his way out of. The streets of London blurred past the window, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing. His phone, now taken by the officers, had stopped streaming. But he knew the damage was already done. The internet never forgets. His audience had watched everything unfold in real time. His so-called fans had quickly turned against him, flooding the comments with outrage. As the vehicle pulled up to the police station, Ethan felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. He had never been in real trouble before. He had always been the guy who broke the rules but never faced real consequences. This time was different. The officers led him inside, where he was processed and placed in a holding room. The walls were cold and bare, a stark contrast to the luxury he was used to. He sat down, his foot tapping anxiously against the floor. Minutes felt like hours. Soon, a senior officer entered the room, holding a file. He sat down across from Ethan, his expression unreadable. "Ethan Caldwell," he said, glancing at the papers. 30 years old, wealthy businessman, social media influencer. He looked up. "Tell me, Mr. Caldwell, did you think what you did today was funny?" Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to make a joke, to lighten the mood, but something in the officer's eyes stopped him. "It was just a prank," he muttered. "I didn't mean any harm." The officer leaned forward. "That prank was an act of vandalism. You defaced a Royal Guard's uniform while he was on duty. That uniform is not just clothing. It is a symbol of duty, discipline, and national pride." His voice was firm. "And you humiliated him in front of the world." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had never thought of it that way. To him, it had just been paint, something that could be washed off. But looking at the officer's serious expression, he realized how much deeper this went. "You are facing serious charges," the officer continued. "Criminal damage, public misconduct. You may think your money can fix this, but the law does not work that way here." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. "You'll be held for questioning," the officer said. "Then, depending on the legal process, you could be fined, banned from the country, or even sentenced to time in prison." Prison. The word hit Ethan like a punch. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was real. For the first time in his life, Ethan truly understood what it meant to regret. As the days passed in the police station, Ethan's anxiety grew. He sat alone in a small room, the walls closing in around him. The reality of his situation became more and more overwhelming. The officers had explained his potential charges: criminal damage, public misconduct, and even a possible ban from the country. The thought of facing any of those consequences felt like a nightmare. The most crushing part was that none of his usual tricks would work here. Money, fame, and influence had always been his safety net. Whenever things went wrong, he could throw a little cash around, smooth things over with a phone call, or even use his social media following to turn things into a joke. But this time, there was no getting out of it. Ethan's lawyer arrived, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who immediately went over the details of the case with him. She was professional, calm, and methodical, but even she couldn't hide the seriousness of the situation. She told him that his actions were being taken very seriously by both the public and the government. "You've become a symbol of disrespect," she said bluntly. "And that's not something easily fixed." Ethan had never felt more alone. He wasn't used to being treated like this, not used to people seeing him as anything other than a source of entertainment. His mind wandered back to the prank. Throwing paint on the Royal Guard seemed so harmless when he first thought of it. But now he saw the full picture. The pride of the British people, their tradition, their symbols of history. He had attacked all of that. And worse, he had done it for nothing more than views. It wasn't just the legal trouble that weighed on him now. It was the public outcry. The internet had turned on him quickly. People he thought were his loyal fans had started to voice their anger. Social media had gone wild with the story, and the comments were relentless. "You went too far. Disrespectful to the highest degree. This guy doesn't deserve fame." Even the news stations picked it up, airing clips of the moment he threw the paint, showing how quickly things spiraled out of control. What had once seemed like an amusing stunt was now a symbol of his arrogance and lack of respect. The backlash was loud and unforgiving. In the quiet moments, Ethan started to reflect on the life he had built. Was this really who he wanted to be? A man who would go to any length to get attention, no matter the cost. What had happened to the fun-loving guy who just wanted to make people laugh? It seemed so distant now, lost in the wake of his foolish decision. As the hours stretched into days, the weight of his actions pressed harder on him. The thought of a fine, a lifetime ban from the UK, or, worse, prison began to feel inevitable. He had never imagined that one impulsive decision, one careless prank, could undo everything. And now, as he faced the reality of his actions, he could no longer escape the consequences. Ethan wished he could go back. He wished he could take back the moment he thought it would be funny to throw paint on a royal guard. But it was too late. As Ethan sat in the holding room, his thoughts began to spiral. The weight of everything he had done, everything he had lost, pressed heavily on him. It was as though the reality of his actions was settling in now, in this quiet, isolated space. His lawyer had left for a moment, giving him time to reflect. In the silence, all the consequences he had been trying to avoid flooded his mind. The live stream, the viral video. He had thought they would make him a legend. He had envisioned millions of likes, comments, and people cheering him on. But instead, his once glamorous life was slipping through his fingers like sand. The anger and disappointment of his audience, who had once been his loyal followers, cut deeper than anything he had expected. They weren't laughing anymore. In fact, many of them had turned against him, no longer idolizing the prankster he had carefully crafted online. Some fans had expressed their outrage by publicly distancing themselves from him. It hurt more than he cared to admit. The world had judged him, not for the first time, but this time it was different. This time, it wasn't just people questioning his stunts. They were questioning his character. The way he had acted, without regard for the people around him, without respect for the traditions and symbols of another country, it had made people angry. Deep down, Ethan knew he deserved that anger. He couldn't blame anyone for being upset with him. The worst part was, he couldn't escape the growing feeling of regret. The moment he had chosen to pour the paint on the royal guard was now a distant memory, but every time he replayed it in his mind, it felt more wrong. Why hadn't he thought of the consequences before? Why hadn't he realized the significance of what he was doing? It wasn't just some guy in a costume. It was a symbol of duty, of service, and pride. He had disrespected that symbol for the sake of a laugh, for a few minutes of fame. Ethan's lawyer returned a short time later, but she didn't bring good news. She had spoken with the authorities, and they were still considering the charges. "It's not looking good, Ethan," she said. "The authorities are taking this very seriously. They're talking about a fine, but there's also the possibility of a travel ban. And honestly, jail time isn't off the table. The media is all over this. The public is demanding accountability." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Ethan had never been good with authority, and the idea of facing real legal consequences made him feel completely helpless. He had never felt more powerless in his life. He was used to being the one in control, the one who called the shots. But now he was at the mercy of a system he had never thought he would need to understand. And then there was the guard. Ethan couldn't get the image of the royal guard out of his head. The man who had stood so still, so unaffected by what had happened. The guard had done his job, remained composed and professional, while Ethan had acted without thinking, driven by a desire for attention and validation. It wasn't lost on him how ridiculous the contrast was. He had disrespected not just a person, but an entire institution. Ethan had been all about himself, and in doing so, he had hurt others. The next few hours dragged on, and he could feel the walls closing in on him. Ethan tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but the comments were endless. Most of them were angry, calling him out for his immaturity and lack of respect. Some of them even called for him to be banned from social media entirely. He knew he couldn't erase what had happened, but the idea of facing this kind of public shaming made him sick to his stomach. His phone buzzed with more messages, some from friends, others from people in the media. Everyone had something to say, but none of it was positive. The ones who had once praised him for his boldness and humor were now nowhere to be found. Those who had stuck around were offering shallow apologies and promises to stay supportive, but the damage had already been done. No one was on his side now. His lawyer tried to reassure him, explaining that the legal process would take time and that there were still options to minimize the consequences. But as she spoke, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his life was unraveling. The fame he had once worked so hard for was slipping through his fingers, and no amount of money or apologies could take back what he had done. For the first time, Ethan understood the real cost of his actions, the cost of his own arrogance. The consequences were no longer just words on a page. They were real, and they were about to change everything. As the days passed, Ethan's anxiety grew. He had been told that the legal process could take time, but time only made things worse. The more he thought about what had happened, the more he realized how much he had taken for granted. He had always lived in a bubble, surrounded by luxury and the adoration of his followers. He had never truly understood the power of his actions and the ripple effects they could have. Now he was learning the hard way. His lawyer, Sarah, had arranged a meeting with the authorities, hoping to negotiate a lighter sentence. But the atmosphere at the police station felt colder than before. The officers treated him with a sense of seriousness that made him feel small. No one was laughing. No one was praising him for his social media stunts. They treated him like any other person who had broken the law. Ethan was no longer a celebrity in their eyes. He was just a man who had made a costly mistake. The media continued to feed on the story, constantly updating the public on the progress of his case. His name appeared everywhere. Ethan's social media pages were flooded with hateful comments, people calling him disrespectful, arrogant, and immature. It stung more than he cared to admit. The fame that had once made him feel invincible now felt like a prison. His followers, the ones who had cheered for him, were now turning their backs on him. And he couldn't blame them. He had crossed a line, and they weren't about to let him forget it. Ethan's mind kept returning to the Royal Guard. That was the turning point, wasn't it? The moment he had poured paint over someone who had given their life to serve the country. It was something he had never truly considered when he first came up with the idea for the prank. He had been so caught up in the excitement of creating a viral moment, so focused on the likes and shares, that he had ignored the deeper meaning behind his actions. Now, it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. The guard, the symbol of duty and respect, had been the unwitting victim of his careless actions. And now, Ethan had to face the consequences of disrespecting that symbol. It wasn't just about the legal charges anymore. Ethan began to understand the emotional toll his actions had taken on others. The Royal Guard wasn't just a man in a uniform. He represented a rich history, a long-standing tradition of sacrifice and service. And Ethan had thoughtlessly desecrated that for a laugh. The more he reflected on it, the more ashamed he felt. How could he have been so blind to the significance of what he had done? The guilt ate at him. He hadn't been the person he wanted to be. He had prided himself on being a good person, someone who made people smile and brought joy to others. But this wasn't joy. This was harm. He had hurt the very people he had wanted to entertain, and now they had turned on him. The words reckless, disrespectful, and entitled haunted him. As the days turned into weeks, the situation only seemed to get worse. The legal process was moving slowly, but the public scrutiny was constant. He had tried to apologize, to explain that it had been a mistake, but the damage was already done. Some people were willing to forgive him, but the majority of them had lost faith in him. The media wasn't helping. Every new report made him look more and more like the villain in his own story. He wasn't just a man who had made a bad decision. He was the guy who had disrespected an entire nation's tradition for the sake of fame. Ethan's friends, the ones who had once been by his side through every adventure, now kept their distance. Some had reached out to offer their support, but it felt hollow. They weren't the ones who had to face the consequences. They weren't the ones being dragged through the mud. The loneliness was overwhelming. Ethan had thought that his popularity would always protect him, that he could always rely on his image to get him out of any jam. But now, that image had shattered, and he was left to pick up the pieces. In those quiet moments, when the world around him felt distant and cold, Ethan realized how far he had fallen. He had once been the life of the party, the center of attention, but now he was just another man facing the consequences of his own actions. He couldn't go back. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused. All he could do now was face the truth and hope that someday, somehow, he would be able to rebuild what he had lost. But deep down, Ethan knew that even if he managed to rebuild, he would never be the same again. The lessons he had learned through this ordeal would stay with him forever, reminding him that every action, every decision had consequences, and sometimes those consequences were far greater than he could ever imagine. As time went on, Ethan began to understand the true weight of his situation. He had spent days, then weeks, caught in a whirlwind of negative attention. At first, he had hoped that the storm would pass, that eventually the internet would move on, and people would forget what he had done. But as the weeks dragged on, he realized how wrong he was. His mistake wasn't something that could just be swept under the rug. It wasn't something that could be erased with an apology or a clever social media post. His actions had left a lasting impact, not only on the royal guard, but on the people who had looked up to him. The court date loomed closer, and the pressure mounted. Ethan knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions, but what he didn't expect was the deep sense of shame that had taken root inside him. He had always thought of himself as someone who was above the rules, someone who could get away with anything because of his fame. But now, sitting in the quiet of his apartment, the reality hit him hard. Fame didn't protect him anymore. It didn't shield him from the fallout. He had made a mistake, and he had to own up to it. The media continued to follow every step of his case. Every new headline seemed to dig deeper into his past, exposing not just his actions, but his character. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt truly vulnerable. The very thing he had relied on for years, his public image, was now the thing that had caused him so much pain. People weren't just judging the prank anymore. They were judging who he was as a person. The public's perception of him had shifted, and no matter how hard he tried to explain himself, he couldn't change what they had seen. He tried to reach out to the royal guard, hoping for some sort of forgiveness or understanding. The guard, who had been so stoic in the moment of the prank, remained silent. Ethan could only imagine the frustration and disappointment that he must have felt. That silence, though, spoke volumes. It wasn't just a lack of response. It was a reflection of the deeper issue. The royal guard, like so many others, had been hurt by what Ethan had done, and no words could take that pain away. His lawyer had explained that there might still be a way to reduce the legal consequences, but the truth was that the public had already made up their mind. The court would likely be lenient, but Ethan knew that the real penalty was the damage to his reputation. That was something that couldn't be fixed easily. He had burned bridges with so many people, both online and in real life. The relationships he had once valued now felt distant and strained. Even his closest friends, the ones who had supported him through thick and thin, were now unsure of what to say or how to help. Ethan began to realize that his life would never be the same. The fame he had once thought was so important now felt irrelevant. The parties, the events, the constant spotlight, it all seemed so shallow in comparison to the lessons he was learning now. He had been so focused on the pursuit of attention that he had forgotten the importance of respect. Respect for others, respect for traditions, and most importantly, respect for himself. He began to take long walks to clear his head, trying to find some sense of peace amidst the chaos. With every step, he reflected on his actions, on the mistakes he had made, and on the person he had been. The Ethan who had thought it was funny to prank a royal guard seemed like a completely different person now, someone he barely recognized. That version of himself had been selfish, impulsive, and careless. But the person he was becoming, in the midst of this struggle, was someone who understood the true cost of his actions. The world hadn't forgotten about the prank, and neither had Ethan. But slowly, over time, he started to understand that his journey wasn't about regaining his old fame or winning back his followers. It was about finding a way to rebuild his integrity and learn from the mistake that had almost ruined him. There was no going back to the way things were, but that didn't mean he couldn't move forward as a better person. The legal proceedings finally came to an end, with a fine and a public apology being the main consequences. Ethan knew that the punishment wasn't severe, but the real punishment was the lesson he had learned. He would never be the same person again, and in a way that was the silver lining. He had made a mistake, but he had grown from it. And though it might take time, he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn back the respect he had lost, not just from the public, but from himself.